History of England, Chapter 13, Part 13. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The History of England from the Accession of James II by Thomas Babington Macaulay, Chapter 13, Part 13. It was next considered what was to be the plan of the campaign. Lochiel was for advancing, for marching towards Mackay, wherever Mackay might be, and for giving battle again. It can hardly be supposed that success had so turned the head of the wise chief of the Camerons as to make him insensible of the danger of the course which he recommended. But he probably conceived that nothing but a choice between dangers was left to him. His notion was that vigorous action was necessary to the very being of a Highland army, and that the coalition of clans would last only while they were impatiently pushing forward from battlefield to battlefield. He was again overruled. All his hopes of success were now at an end. His pride was severely wounded. He had submitted to the ascendancy of a great captain, but he cared as little as any Whig for a royal commission. He had been willing to be the right hand of Dundee, but he would not be ordered about by cannon. He quitted the camp and retired to Lochaber. He indeed directed his clan to remain, but the clan, deprived of the leader whom it adored, and aware that he had withdrawn himself in ill humour, was no longer the same terrible column which had a few days before kept so well the vow to perish or to conquer. MacDonald of Sleat, whose forces exceeded in number those of any other of the confederate chiefs, followed Lochiel's example, and returned to Skye. Mackay's arrangements were by this time complete, and he had little doubt that, if the rebels came down to attack him, the regular army would retrieve the honour which had been lost at Killiecrankie. His chief difficulties arose from the unwise interference of the ministers of the Crown at Edinburgh with matters which ought to have been left to his direction. The truth seems to be that they, after the ordinary fashion of men who, having no military experience, sit in judgment on military operations, considered success as the only test of the ability of a commander. Whoever wins a battle is, in the estimation of such persons, a great general. Whoever is beaten is a bad general, and no general had ever been more completely beaten than Mackay. William, on the other hand, continued to place entire confidence in his unfortunate lieutenant. To the disparaging remarks of critics who had never seen a skirmish, Portland replied by his master's orders that Mackay was perfectly trustworthy, that he was brave, that he understood war better than any other officer in Scotland, and that it was much to be regretted that any prejudice should exist against so good a man and so good a soldier. The unjust contempt with which the Scotch Privy Councillors regarded Mackay led them into a great error, which might well have caused a great disaster. The Cameronian regiment was sent to garrison Dunkeld. Of this arrangement Mackay altogether disapproved. He knew that at Dunkeld these troops would be near the enemy, that they would be far from all assistance, that they would be in an open town, that they would be surrounded by a hostile population, that they were very imperfectly disciplined, though doubtless brave and zealous, that they were regarded by the whole Jacobite party throughout Scotland with peculiar malevolence, and that in all probability some great effort would be made to disgrace and destroy them. The general's opinion was disregarded, and the Cameronians occupied the post assigned to them. It soon appeared that his forebodings were just. The inhabitants of the country round Dunkeld furnished Cannon with intelligence, and urged him to make a bold push. The peasantry of Athol, impatient for spoil, came in great numbers to swell his army. The regiment hourly expected to be attacked, and became discontented and turbulent. And the men, intrepid indeed both from constitution and from enthusiasm, but not yet broken to habits of military submission, expostulated with Cleland, who commanded them. They had, they imagined, been recklessly, if not perfidiously, sent to certain destruction. They were protected by no ramparts. They had a very scanty stock of ammunition. They were hemmed in by enemies. An officer might mount and gallop beyond reach of danger in an hour, but the private soldier must stay and be butchered. "Neither I," said Cleland, "nor any of my officers will in any extremity abandon you. Bring out my horse, all our horses, they shall be shot dead." These words produced a complete change of feeling. The men answered that the horses should not be shot, that they wanted no pledge from their brave colonel except his word, and that they would run the last hazard with him. They kept their promise well. The Puritan blood was now thoroughly up, and what that blood was when it was up had been proved on many fields of battle. That night the regiment passed under arms. On the morning of the following day, the 21st of August, all the hills round Dunkeld were alive with bonnets and plaids. Cannon's army was much larger than that which Dundee had commanded. More than 1,000 horses laden with baggage accompanied his march. Both the horses and the baggage were probably part of the booty of Killiecrankie. The whole number of Highlanders was estimated by those who saw them at from 4,000 to 5,000 men. They came furiously on. The outposts of the Cameronians were speedily driven in. The assailants came pouring on every side into the streets. The church, however, held out obstinately. But the greater part of the regiment made its stand behind a wall which surrounded a house belonging to the Marquess of Atholl. This wall, which had 2 or 3 days before been hastily repaired with timber and loose stones, the soldiers defended desperately with musket, pike, and halberd. Their bullets were soon spent, but some of the men were employed in cutting lead from the roof of the Marquess's house and shaping it into slugs. Meanwhile, all the neighbouring houses were crowded from top to bottom with Highlanders who kept up a galling fire from the windows. Cleland, while encouraging his men, was shot dead. The command devolved on Major Henderson. In another minute Henderson fell pierced with 3 mortal wounds. His place was supplied by Captain Munro, and the contest went on with undiminished fury. A party of the Cameronians sallied forth, set fire to the houses from which the fatal shots had come, and turned the keys in the doors. In one single dwelling 16 of the enemy were burnt alive. Those who were in the fight described it as a terrible initiation for recruits. Half the town was blazing, and with the incessant roar of the guns were mingled the piercing shrieks of wretches perishing in the flames. The struggle lasted 4 hours. By that time the Cameronians were reduced nearly to their last flask of powder, but their spirit never flagged. "The enemy will soon carry the wall. Be it so, we will retreat into the house, we will defend it to the last, and, if they force their way into it, we will burn it over their heads and our own." But, while they were revolving these desperate projects, they observed that the fury of the assault slackened. Soon the Highlanders began to fall back. Disorder visibly spread among them, and whole bands began to march off to the hills. It was in vain that their general ordered them to return to the attack. Perseverance was not one of their military virtues. The Cameronians, meanwhile, with shouts of defiance, invited Amalek and Moab to come back and to try another chance with the chosen people. But these exhortations had as little effect as those of cannon. In a short time the whole Gaelic army was in full retreat towards Blair. Then the drums struck up. The victorious Puritans threw their caps into the air, raised with one voice a psalm of triumph and thanksgiving, and waved their colours, colours which were on that day unfurled for the first time in the face of an enemy, but which have since been proudly borne in every quarter of the world, and which are now embellished with the Sphinx and the dragon, emblems of brave actions achieved in Egypt and in China. The Cameronians had good reason to be joyful and thankful, for they had finished the rear. In the rebel camp all was discord and dejection. The Highlanders blamed Cannon, Cannon blamed the Highlanders, and the host which had been the terror of Scotland melted fast away. the Confederate chiefs signed an association by which they declared themselves faithful subjects of King James, and bound themselves to meet again at a future time. Having gone through this form, for it was no more, they departed, each to his home. Cannon and his Irishmen retired to the Isle of Mull. The Lowlanders who had followed Dundee to the mountains shifted for themselves as best they could. On the 24th of August, exactly 4 weeks after the Gaelic army had won the battle of Killiecrankie, that army ceased to exist. It ceased to exist as the army of Montrose had, more than 40 years earlier, ceased to exist, not in consequence of any great blow from without, but by a natural dissolution, the effect of internal malformation. All the fruits of victory were gathered by the vanquished. The castle of Blair, which had been the immediate object of the contest, opened its gates to Mackay, and a chain of military posts, extending northward as far as Inverness, protected the cultivators of the plains against the predatory inroads of the mountaineers. During the autumn, the government was much more annoyed by the Whigs of the Low Country than by the Jacobites of the hills. The club, which had, in the late session of Parliament, attempted to turn the kingdom into an oligarchical republic, and which had induced the estates to refuse supplies and stop the administration of justice, continued to sit during the recess, and harried the ministers of the crown by systematic agitation. The organisation of this body, contemptible as it may appear to the generation which has seen the Roman Catholic Association and the League against the Corn Laws, was then thought marvellous and formidable. The leaders of the Confederacy boasted that they would force the King to do them right. They got up petitions and addresses, and tried to inflame the populace by means of the press and the pulpit, employed emissaries among the soldiers, and talked of bringing up a large body of Covenanters from the west to overawe the Privy Council. In spite of every artifice, however, the ferment of the public mind gradually subsided. The government, after some hesitation, ventured to open the courts of justice, which the Estates had closed. The Lords of Session, appointed by the King, took their seats, and Sir James Dalrymple presided. The club attempted to induce the advocates to absent themselves from the bar, and entertained some hope that the mob would pull the judges from the bench, but it speedily became clear that there was much more likely to be a scarcity of fees than of lawyers to take them on. The common people of Edinburgh were well pleased to see again a tribunal associated in their imagination with the dignity and prosperity of their city, and by many signs it appeared that the false and greedy faction which had commanded a majority of the legislature did not command a majority of the nation. End of chapter 13.